A cabinet resignation, the loss of a Downing Street chief of staff, the Chancellor rewriting her own CV, concert tickets, football tickets, suits, dresses and glasses, all handed to Labour MPs by shady donors. One major donor being given a number 10 pass only for it to be rescinded days later. Another plum donor given a plum civil service role in the Treasury. Appointments of party apparatchiks to civil service roles, 20,000 illegal migrants, more requisitioned hotels, mass protests from farmers, bewildered and blindsided pensioners, inheritance tax hikes, national insurance tax hikes on working people. Indeed, by some measures, the largest tax hikes in the history of the country in any one budget. And now, the abandonment of the government's central mission for growth. Yes, a government reset just 21 weeks into power. It's what Keir Starmer is calling his plan for change. Instead, it's clear this may well be a change of plan. Well, it's easy to see why this reset is coming. I don't need to roll through that list of scandals anymore. But that doesn't make this reset any less painful for Sir Keir Starmer. His ministry has faced a confluence of bad news, bad decisions, and unwelcome international events. And could it be that the election of one Donald Trump has overturned Starmer's flagship election ambition of achieving the fastest growth in the G7? Yes, Labour's growth mission was the answer to every question they were asked on how they would fund various policy commitments. We'll supercharge growth, they said. We'll grow faster than any country in the G7. Well, this week, that language has been dropped. Why? Clearly the government doesn't believe it will achieve the highest growth in the G7. Over in the United States, Donald Trump has promised to, as he says, drill baby drill. His energy policy, alongside wider deregulation, is likely to increase American economic output. US GDP growth is already significantly higher than European and UK levels, and it looks set to continue along that path. While the US goes all in on energy dominance, drilling for oil, fracking for gas, firing up nuclear power, and prodigiously laying down solar and wind farms too, the UK has chosen to end oil exploration and ban onshore natural gas extraction. We're leaving that wealth beneath our feet, helping to ensure the UK consumers pay the highest prices for energy in the Western world. Looking to other G7 countries too, recent polling shows that Justin Trudeau's Liberal Party could collapse from first to fourth place, with the pro-growth, pro-house-building Conservative Party of Canada on course for a super-majority. Well, that mandate could deliver Canada a supercharged growth rate too. Meanwhile, back in the UK, energy is still getting more expensive, much-touted planning reform policy is still yet to materialise, and new taxes on jobs have made employing people ever more expensive. All that hurts growth prospects. Even according to the Office for Budget Responsibility in their Blue Book that accompanied the budget. So what are we left with? A British government that, despite its election rhetoric, simply hasn't yet had the political will to take the difficult pro-growth reform decisions. And therefore this week, a shift in rhetoric. The Telegraph now reports that Keir Starmer will stop talking about his growth mission as seeking the fastest growth in the G7, and instead simply about making sure the public feel the benefits of growth. Part of this, of course, is that other countries, particularly the United States and Canada, are now expected to perform more strongly than when Keir Starmer first made his fastest growth pledge. But the other part of this is what we're doing ourselves in the UK. Taxes, particularly taxes on employment, have risen. Debt has risen too, raising both inflation and, crucially, interest rate expectations, dragging down growth. After the budget, growth expectations as published in that OBR Blue Book did not rise. They fell. Looking back, it's clear the government thinks of itself as facing a choice between growing the economy and spending more on the NHS. And out of that dichotomy, it's chosen the NHS. Now, leaving aside how this is a false dichotomy for a second, of course, economic growth itself is a means to higher NHS spending rather than an impediment to it. It's clear that this is Labour's calculation when you look at where the growth-crushing tax rises in the budget went. Now, even if you're to believe the government's spin of £22 billion in unfunded commitments, the so-called black hole, well, the OBR said that was more like £9 billion, and the government changed the debt rule in the budget to allow for extra borrowing, which would have covered that in its entirety. Well, despite all that, tax rises in the budget raised £40 billion. Now, you don't need me to tell you that 40 billion is a bigger number than 22 billion. It's an even bigger number than 9 billion and prodigiously more than the 0 billion that would be implied by that rule on debt that was changed in the budget. Now, if filling in this so-called black hole was the concern of the government, well then, why did it need these tax rises? No, this 40 billion cash grab more than dwarfs any inflated black hole calculation. And where did it all go? Well, largely to the NHS. Before the election, the Labour Party committed on spending just £2 billion extra on the NHS. Their manifesto, and I've read through their costings document, it costed £1 billion on 40,000 more operations, scans and appointments every week, £250 million on doubling the number of NHS CT and MRI scanners, £125 million on a dentistry package and £175 million on mental health support for every school, on top of £410 million on new mental health staff. So totting that all up, that equals £1,960 million. No more. That's less than £2 billion. Well, some of us at the time questioned the Labour Party as to how transformative this roughly £2 billion figure could really be, given the state of the NHS and the fact that the NHS budget has risen by almost £50 billion adjusted for inflation since 2010. Well, a cynic might think that at the time the Labour Party secretly agreed. At the budget, Rachel Reeves poured not £2 billion in the manifesto, not that £2 billion that I just read out and delineated. No, instead it was £23 billion more into the NHS, more than anyone had expected. This was the real budget rabbit. And it came at the cost of a tax on jobs. Had the government stuck to its manifesto commitment on restrained NHS spending, those national insurance contributions wouldn't have had to rise by over £20 billion. And that national insurance rise, of course, will hit jobs, pay and growth. So this is a political choice, and one that was not made this week, but instead made months ago. Perhaps even before the election, with the Labour Party not wanting to announce its preference for higher tax and spend for fear it would harm the party's electoral fortunes. Well, here's what the Health Secretary Wes Streeting had to say when I put that question to him after the budget.
At what point did you decide that hospitals and the NHS more broadly needed £25 billion? At what point did you arrive at that figure?
Well, these were judgments for the Chancellor to make in the round, and a budget process really forces you to think about your priorities and the choices that you face. And I think overall the Chancellor looked at the state of the economy, looked at the state the public finances were left in, and she's made a big judgment call, which was to go for investment over decline. And I listened to Jeremy Hunt, the Shadow Chancellor, this morning, obviously the previous Chancellor before. I think what he and Rishi Sunak got to during their tenure was a transition from the mismanaged decline of Liz Truss and Kwasi Kwarteng to what I'd call managed decline under Rishi Sunak and Jeremy Hunt. We've arrested that decline and we're turning the country around, and that's why the Chancellor's made such big calls on investment, because that's how you create the conditions for the economy to grow, for our public services to succeed, and to make sure that people have the jobs, the security, the public services that they need to lead a good life.
Of course, the reason I ask this question is that that's not what you were saying in the election campaign. You listed specific promises in that election campaign. I've looked through the costings document that accompanied your manifesto. You said £1 billion on 40,000 more operations and £250 million on CT scanners. The whole package added up to around £2 billion. Now you're saying £25 billion. Are you really saying that you changed your mind after the election, or is it what many people suspect, this was your plan all along?
I just point out that, again, and it's a good chance to revisit the election campaign and the questions that we had back then, because we were constantly challenged to pledge more in our manifesto and to spend more in our manifesto. And we resisted that because we knew the public finances were in a dire state and we didn't want to overpromise and then underdeliver, and we wanted to make sure that everything that was in our manifesto, every pledge in it, was fully costed and fully funded.
Hang on.
A promise that we could keep
the
country could afford.
Isn't that
and every single one of those pledges will be delivered.
Isn't that a bait and switch? You didn't put this £25 billion of NHS spending in your manifesto because you didn't want to put the national insurance hike in your manifesto. Now you've raised national insurance by £25 billion. You've put a lot of money into the NHS. That's a legitimate political choice. That's a legitimate thing to do. Left-wing governments tend to tax more and spend more. My question is, why didn't you say that in your manifesto? Doesn't it smack of dishonesty that you chose to avoid this spending pledge in your manifesto just so you could avoid that tax rise in your manifesto?
No political party ever goes into a general election with a full budget document or indeed a spending review or spending plan for an entire parliament, because everyone accepts that in government you have a level of technical advice and expertise necessary to put together something like a budget or a spending review. You also have to judge your choices against wider events. So it is not a realistic expectation to expect any political party to go into an election with a document or a manifesto the size of the budget book that the Chancellor published yesterday or any of her predecessors has published. So that's not a realistic expectation. What is a realistic expectation is that when people publish manifestos, when parties publish manifestos, that they keep all of the promises in it. Now, I know that's not an expectation that's been met for some time with previous governments, but this government is delivering every single commitment in that manifesto. And we have come in, we've looked at the state of the books, we knew it would be bad, it was even worse than we expected, genuinely worse. I mean, just to give you an example from my department, I was told within weeks of entering office that rather than delivering 40,000 more appointments every week to cut waiting lists, I would have to tell the NHS to deliver 20,000 fewer appointments every week because we couldn't afford it because of the black hole. Well, the Chancellor and I didn't tolerate that. We found the money, plugged the black hole, wiped the slate clean and put the NHS in a position to start rebuilding after years of decline.
You talk about realistic
we don't shy away from those choices.
Is it not a realistic expectation of voters to know what they're getting, rather than to have a party promise 1/10 of the spending on the health service, only to get into office and almost immediately row back on that spending commitment, times it by 10, and to row back on their tax commitments, because we know that the OBR has said this tax increase will fall on the wages of workers. It's a £25 billion tax rise that you did not want to include in your manifesto because you know that it would be unpopular. Aren't you taking people for fools? I mean, surely a more honest political strategy would be to say, look, there are problems with the NHS. We know there are problems with the NHS. We want to put more money into the NHS, but it's going to cost you. You didn't make that argument in the general election campaign, and it smacks of dishonesty.
I would accept that challenge if you can find me a single manifesto in our modern political history where the governing party has spelt out every single detail of every single tax and every single spending commitment for the Parliament. That is not how our system can work, let alone should work.
You know, there is a massive difference between a line-by-line delineation and a 10 times greater spending commitment. I mean, these are broad brushstrokes, not line-by-line demands.
Do you think he answered the questions? Well, you can make your own minds up on that. I've been Tom Harwood for GB News. Be sure to subscribe to the GB News YouTube channel for more, and even check out this video right here if you're interested in more GB News original content.